I'm really honored to be here, and I'm really thrilled to be here with Broadbent. CAP has been doing work with the Broadbent Institute over the last several years, and we really do see ourselves as kindred spirits, really engaging on ideas, engaging on practical policy solutions, and how to transform engagement with politics and policy and ideas in our respective countries. We're both multi-issue progressive think tanks, and we do have a shared vision and analysis of how to make progressive policy change in our respective countries. It is true that CAP, the Center for American Progress, has been mostly focused on U.S. domestic policy, but from our founding, we have engaged with progressives around the world to change, to really understand what's happening in our respective countries, to learn about policy solutions, and to make policy change in the U.S. from those ideas. We've created something called Global Progress, and we were very excited this year to host an event in Copenhagen, in Denmark, just about a month ago, and Thomas Mulcair was there, and we learned very much from his insights about policy and politics in Canada. And we hope to continue our understandings and our very fruitful relationship in the years to come. Today, I want to reflect on the various factors and long-term trends that have created what we believe is a progressive majority in the U.S. And a sustainable progressive majority into the future. We now have an election in which President Obama is the first Democrat to win 50% in consecutive elections since FDR. And the country, you know, we are living through a time where it may not seem obvious every day in Washington, but there is a progressive majority in the Senate, but for some degree of gerrymandering, we would have a progressive majority in the House. So it is really my pleasure to talk about with you CAP's role over the last several years in transforming, what we believe is transforming the dialogue in Washington. This is our 10th anniversary year. We started in 2003. It was no accident that we started at a time in the United States where progressives were out of power in the House and the Senate, and in the president. We obviously did not have the presidency. We were really started at the nadir of progressive power in Washington, in the U.S. And we also started at a time where conservatives had thought that they would have a hegemonic control over the U.S. policy. Karl Rove and others were arguing at the time that conservatives would have a governing majority for decades to come. So what we really did during that time is build an ideas infrastructure and an ideas architecture to address our challenges. We believed at the time, and I was privileged to help start the Center for American Progress 10 years ago with John Podesta, who had been Chief of Staff to President Clinton. And at that time, we really understood that it was not just a challenge for progressives to communicate our ideas, but that we had to have new ideas for new challenges, that progressives had really been leaning on the Clinton years in terms of our ideas, and that in the 2000s, in a new century, progressives needed to have new ideas and new solutions. And that's why we invested and helped create an ideas institution that also invested a great deal in communications to ensure that once we had those policy ideas, we were also communicating them effectively, not just in Washington, but our goal was to communicate them effectively in the country. And so from that experience, I'd like to just talk about a few elements of where we are as progressives in the United States. My remarks today will really focus on three main elements that have been integral to what I believe is the progressive majority in the country. First, I'd like to address the shifting demographics in the United States. I will also talk about the new policy framework and ideas that are really the anchor of the conversation in Washington. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about innovations in communications and campaigns, and how that is also transforming politics in the United States. So first, let me discuss demographic change in the U.S. And I know there's been a lot written in the U.S. about the president's election and the connection to the changing demographics. And I do believe that there is a progressive majority that has been created from the changing demographics. Really, since the time of Robert Kennedy's election campaign, progressives have been trying to build together a rainbow coalition made up of African Americans, Latinos, young people, and working class whites to elect progressives, Democratic candidates. And it was really in this election that we've seen that bear fruit. We've obviously, Bill Clinton relied on that coalition to some degree, but this election was historic in that we had 28% of the electorate as people of color. So, as I said earlier, Barack Obama did win with almost 51% of the vote. That doesn't sound so much, but it was pretty good for a Democratic reelection. Bill Clinton did not actually garner a majority when he won reelection, although they both handily won the Electoral College. Democratic Senate candidates have really picked up seats, surprisingly, and as I referenced earlier, the House, though there is still a Republican majority in the House, if you count the actual votes, Democratic candidates for House of Representatives won 1.4 million votes than Republicans. So, that is a challenge for us to have to address redistricting, but I think that really points to the majority views in the country. So why was that possible? Really, first and foremost, the country has transformed, and it's changed, and it will continue to change. We have a program at CAP called the Progress 2050. The United States will be majority people of color by 2043. We have the president won simply because he had strong majorities of African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans. He garnered 39% of the white vote, which was actually the same percentage as Michael Dukakis. So it was really the rising coalition that helped elect the president. Now, there's been a lot of talk in the U.S. about what that really means, and I'm here to say that, I do believe issues of identity have been important in American politics. And in the last election, much of that vote was energized, the lopsided nature of that vote, where Latinos voted 70-30 for President Obama. What's fascinating about this coalition is there's a lot of discussion about dignity issues, but essentially this coalition really focuses on what the government should do and how it should do it, not whether it should do it. And what I mean by that is that the traditional antagonism towards government is really not in the attitudes of either Asian Americans who have an average higher income than whites, or Latinos or African Americans. Across these groups, they have a greater receptivity to government being involved in issues. In fact, 70% across these groups think that the government is getting bigger because the country's problems are bigger, not the government is getting involved in issues that it shouldn't get involved in. And so I think, my hope, but also my expectation is that some of the very hardened politics in the United States that may be hard to understand about the role of government and whether we should be doing things and whether the government should be tackling challenges. I think these issues are going to transform themselves over the next several decades, in interesting ways. And I think, as you see, one of the bright spots of activity in the U.S. is I do think we will pass an immigration reform bill. I think that will pass with a strong number of Republican votes in the Senate. I do believe the House will pass an immigration reform bill, and I do believe that is because people see the country changing. So, but I also want to say that I don't think that we should, when we talk about these issues, we should forget the connection to economic issues. We at CAP are very focused on ensuring that there's economic growth that speaks to a broad coalition. So we believe we need to actually restore that Bobby Kennedy coalition that also included working class whites. And this is how, I do think this also connects to my second theme, which is the central animating arguments in the United States. Although it doesn't seem like it on any particular day when we're talking about, what did the president know or other issues, or, whether we're going to shut down the government or debt relief or et cetera. But the central arguments in the election are also arguments that animate this coalition, and they are about whether the country will grow a strong and stable middle class, whether the country will grow together, whether the country will grow apart. And to return to the themes of CAP, I think one of the contributions we've made in the last several years is that there has been an animating impulse, a concern in the United States about the American dream dying, middle class, the ability of the middle class to succeed. There's been heavy downward pressure on wages in the United States. And the political process has been very engaged in a debate between how we grow, whether we grow by investing in the middle class, by ensuring people can get into the middle class, or whether we should have tax policies that essentially help the wealthiest amongst us. And by doing so, we'll have growth in that form. And so we've championed at CAP this idea of MiddleOut Economics and really made the economic analysis as to why growth is better when you have a strong and stable middle class. Over a year ago, we did an analysis of a report about why investing in the middle class is a better form of growth. You have stronger growth from it. Why it creates more demand and makes your economy work better, how it creates the next generation of innovators. And so we did play an important role, I think, in working with the president and the White House to engage in and to come up with this frame of MiddleOut Economics. President Obama himself championed it all throughout the election. And I think that was an instance in which an ideas infrastructure existed that helped create the argument for which a political leader can help adopt and obviously popularize. I mean, no one tells a story better or more creatively than the president. And so when so I think that's another way in which politics is transforming itself. This is a central argument again. I think it's important for the president to always come back to this argument, regardless of what's happening in Washington. And I think part of the struggle in politics is to ensure that these sets of issues are addressed. And most importantly, one of the great assets President Obama has as a political leader is that he seems on the side of working Americans, middle-class Americans. And it is his policy platform that connects with his own narrative and his own story to drive that argument. And I think that is another reason why President Obama won re-election. And I hope that we will return to these debates in Washington because we still have incredible challenges around growth. And finally, I'd like to just spend a few minutes to talk about the changing nature of communications and how that has transformed itself as well in Washington in terms of what everybody does. Again, I think as mentioned, I worked on the 2008 campaign for President Obama, then Senator Obama. And in that period, one of the reasons why he was so successful is that he had really innovated in terms of ways he was directly communicating with people and very much connected his own personal story and his own narrative to particular groups. So he very much energized young voters through a direct message of a new generation of leadership and a new generation of, and hopefully a new generation of change in Washington. And we see actually that looking at 2012, those developments were taken to a whole new level. And the campaign mastered an ability to talk directly to voters through the use of social media, Twitter, Facebook, et cetera, and pioneered ways in which it could talk, it could use online media and online ads to tailor its information directly to voters. So they spent enormous amounts of money on particular segments where they knew where women independent voters in Virginia were getting information about health care and use that as a means and vehicle to make change. And how that relates actually to the work of CAP and ideas institutions is that I do think for progressives we need to think through innovations and how we talk to people. One of the things I'm most proudest of CAP's work is that we developed in an innovative communications site. It used to be a blog, but now we've hired reporters, so it actually breaks news. It's called Think Progress, and it gets 5 million unique visitors a month. And most of the ways it does that is really breaking news and using social media, Twitter and Facebook, to help move that information, that content, amongst millions and millions of people. As of one example, which is that about 2 months ago, we had a reporter that went into Wisconsin. The National Rifle Association had a press conference, had an annual conference in Wisconsin, and our reporter actually was covering the event, and there was no other reporters there because it was just like this annual conference, and he covered the event, and the NRA, one of the NRA speakers said, you know, Newtown is just something we need to get through. Everyone will forget about it in a few, we just need to hold tight, and everyone will forget about it in a few months, and then we can move on, we can move back to where we are. So we just need to ride this wave, or ride through this wave. We covered that. That story moved to 655 additional sites in the space of a day. But then national reporters started asking the NRA about it. And Senate Democrats in the Congress started grilling the NRA, and several senators took to the floor. And the NRA, by 3 days later, had to repudiate those remarks. And those are ways in which communications is changing the way people hear and learn. And I know people, you know, there is a lot of discussion about the coverage and news, but what we've found is that people are very hungry for information, but they really want to connect it to advocacy and ways to take action. And I think actually that rather than poo-pooing these new generations of ways to communicate to folks, you know, we have real opportunities to democratize information, arm citizens with information, and have them become even more active in local policy and politics. Because we have found that what people get most excited about is information they can use to make decisions, to hold people accountable, to tell their friends where they are, and they get really animated by it. And so that's another area in which, in fact, I'm optimistic about the policy change, about the landscape, and how our country is changing, and how we will continue to change. So let me just say in conclusion, as I think back to the early days of CAP's founding, I think we've come a long way. I also think that the country has come a long way, the United States has come a long way. I think those things have a few things to do with each other. I don't want to overstate it, but I do think that having an infrastructure of ideas where people can really hear all voices provides a real opportunity for people to engage. I honestly believe that it was because of the institutions that were created, not just Center for American Progress, but other institutions that were created in 2003, 2004 to, for CAP, create ideas and communicate them effectively. And that's very important in a democracy, and especially a thriving democracy. And so I'm excited to be here. Thank you all very much. And again, I'm incredibly grateful for the strong partnership we have with the Broadbent Institute. We learn a lot from them. I hope they learn something from us, and that we can grow and change together in the years to come.